Here it is. White square here. Yeah.
You did have pretty, you learned a lot about it.
How do you do that? There's nothing comparable.
Nothing is like.
Yeah, you made such a nice. You should be living in a shack.
What happened is, that cabin.
Throw it in there, stick that hand in the box.
Oh, because your fish
Throw it in there, throw it out.
right? Or is that? Just the eggs.
Morning, how you doing? Good. See you. Having the sun. Yeah. So nice. Yes, bees again this year.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, well,
Did you hide somewhere?
It's
Mine made it through so far. Yeah, they were flying. Yeah, they were flying around Friday after I got home from work. No, I tried out there.
Yeah.
Bees.
It seems like a realtor would know what the properties around here are and what might be.
Might have to start putting a little pond patty in there and, you know, activate them, and the cleaners start laying.
I think they just, see, ours is, yeah. Ours still is above the level of the exemption for seniors, so, you know.
I have that.
He doesn't really remember. Something like that, yeah, I think ours is in the 200s. But, you know, well, how many acres?
I guess I'm sensitive to it.
Oh, okay.
Swell up. That one coming right in the back of my neck, dead center, my spinal cord itches. Body reacted.
Cindy, what are you doing out there?
Yeah, I think it's the end of the month.
Happy day. When the sun comes out, that puts a little heat on it, just to maintain that heat in there. We're pretty good.
I'm not.
It's pretty nice.
Yeah, well, that's what he said he was gonna do,
Yeah, I saw, I had never.
Hey, you said it was.
She had a lot of health problems.
Oh, yeah.
Probably.
You got the behind
He said that they got back to
I've had both that before.
Nice.
My
Yeah.
experience. So limited.
I put them in there.
So anyway.
That's what I heard.
Well, because it's still within the exemption amount,
But they got a,
I didn't.
Maybe they got these as fast. They put the seat on there. On the back. It's messed up.
Yeah, that's the first thing.
Yeah.
First, I was just doing a veil. That's how my dad did it. Just a veil, man. They'll sting me right through it too. Yeah, I need to upsize this thing. Not a couple suit. I got up to like 16 quarts.
I know, I had.
Yeah, good, yeah.
They did pretty good.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. So you want to do, you want to do it. And that's.
I know, I
They did before. They look at ours and say, oh,
I didn't either. Somebody told me, and I said, we just did that. I know, I keep hearing that every day. I don't know why they. Yeah. I can get by just so you know what. Thank you.
yes. You want it accessible. Oh, yeah. But it's good. Yes.
Well, he pushed hard.
So I wonder if that both is. I don't know anything about it. Oh, okay, moving forward. But I have switched from this to this. I don't know. I'm trying to get more information. Start jumping. This is spring break.
Okay.
Yes, I want to continue going, but I always come and modify.
So they're always.
Yeah, you know, I just saw something this morning, quick, steps, have to have the side steps. And I was just,
A thing that was
and
unexpected.
so when you said that, I went, oh, I mean, it was just an ad for doing some steps. You know, the big thing now is walking and steps.
Just not
My-
part of my done yesterday.
Yeah.
They have me put it back. My federal taxes. I usually do them in January.
Maybe I need to do those more straight.
Trump wants to do it later.
Right. Did someone re-injure her back or is it just a reoccurring? Yeah, that's right. Well, they start a fire over. Right.
Out there doing the time.
But I checked with her. I do. Her boy.
All right, let's go ahead and get started. Are there any announcements before we get started? I know there's a few people out of town. I'm not sure about the Jaworskis. Nobody seems to be sure. I know they were leaving, but I wasn't sure when they were coming back. I know they're in Homer? Okay.
Nate's team lost their regional thing, so they're,
So that's why they're back, okay, because I knew they were leaving for basketball, but I didn't know when or how long it was gonna
they got back yesterday.
Okay,
And then they're home.
gotcha. Okay,
My friend Jim, had the accident in Anchorage, but he had his eye surgery and then he had foot surgery when he came back to rebuilding the bottom part of his foot. Well, they're going up tomorrow for him to have an appointment, so hopefully that'll go good.
Wait, what was his name? I missed that.
Dean,
Oh, Dean, okay. Yes, I remember you telling us about Dean before.
he's having his first checkup after the surgery this tomorrow.
Okay.
And Susie's blood pressure is better, but it's still high. She's still being monitored pretty closely.
Okay.
My friend's grandson, Cade, has been sick and they can't figure out what's going on, but he's been having stomach problems and throwing up, even passing out, so they're supposed to take him to a specialist. He's just 17, I think, so we should get prayers to Cade.
Okay. Well, there's Eric Lyons from Apologetics Press is in Homer. Has been the last couple days, is still there this morning, so there's tons of people from
Soldotna and the valley that are down in Homer. So a lot of people traveling. Apparently that's where the Georgies are. Just for everybody to be aware, there's a lot of folks traveling, and a lot of our folks that are gone north and other places as well. So, all right. Well, let's have a word of prayer before we get started. Heavenly Father, we thank you for this opportunity to gather this morning and to look into your word. We thank you for preserving your word for us, words that were spoken by inspiration centuries ago by your prophets, in this case. And we thank you for that and the ability to look at what Jeremiah had to say. We thank you for all your written word that we have that was brought to us through many men, and we believe to be as you intended it. We ask that you would be with us in studying this, help us to gain a deeper understanding of the things that you want us to know. Be with those of our number that are unable to be with us, those that are traveling and those dealing with other situations. Be with Candy's friend Dean in his checkup tomorrow. Help his travels to that checkup to go well and the results to be good. Be with Susie in her blood pressure situation. And be with Dice's friend's grandson, Cade, and whatever he has going on, help him to be able to accurately diagnose that and figure out a treatment plan and to help him to feel better. Be with all the ongoing things that we have going on here, people with health concerns and other issues. Be with the upcoming lectureship and the effort that we need to put into that, help that to be an uplifting time that brings you glory and honor. We have our worship services later today. Help them to be pleasing to you, uplifting to us, and to point people towards Christ. These prayers and thanks we give in Jesus' name. Amen. All right, today we are going to be looking at Jeremiah, both chapter 20 and 21. Just kind of a brief outline of that and the sections. Jeremiah chapter 20, the first 6 verses are pretty much historical accounts. It tells of Jeremiah's imprisonment. We'll be looking at that. The second half of Jeremiah chapter 20 is Jeremiah's lament. He's just been thrown in the stocks, and we'll discuss that. And so he has kind of a personal lament, and that's the remainder of chapter 20. So chapter 20 is kind of in 2 parts. It's what happened, and then it's Jeremiah's lament. Some scholars think this was, what he had to say while he was in the stocks, but there's no way to really know that that's actually when he said this, but it does seem to be with this, so it does seem to be somewhat connected. And then chapter 21, and I think we said when we started Jeremiah, a lot of this is not in chronological order. Chapter 21 doesn't seem to be at the same time frame as the rest. Chapter 20, immediately followed the events in chapter 18 and chapter 19, where we studied in the last couple of weeks with the potter's wheel, and then him going and breaking the piece of pottery and announcing condemnation. And that condemnation is what got him thrown in the stocks. Don't be saying bad things about us. We'll give you a whipping and throw you in irons. Whereas chapter 21, the city's under siege. So we know this is significantly later. And in the coming chapters, we'll actually see some things that are definitely out of chronological order. Like in a few weeks when we get to chapter 24, we're going to be with a king that was before the king that's in chapter 21. So So it's pretty easy, even without a lot of in-depth study, to see these things are not necessarily laid out in chronological order. But once we get to 21, for the next few chapters, he's going to be talking about things that happened during times when they were under siege. So that's kind of as near as I can tell, at least one of the reasons for it being organized this way. Whereas up to now, it's all just been prediction of difficulties. And if we have time, I don't know if we will, we'll actually look at, I think it's the last or the next to last chapter of 2 Chronicles. That kind of outlines this, and under the kings that were after Josiah, the last 3 or 4 kings, some of them didn't last very long, and there was actually, Babylon came up and kind of took away one of their kings, took away some of their wealth and put them under tribute and put somebody else on the throne before they actually come in the end and actually haul them away. So it's not like the last years that Jerusalem had freedom and independence and then, oh wow, the siege happened. It's like there was a lot of bad things happening for the last final years of Jerusalem. They were paying tribute to Egypt. They were paying tribute to Babylon at various points in their final years. And so looking at what we're going to see in chapter 21 is kind of surprising. That they're like, oh yeah, this will all be fine. We should fight them. And it's kind of like, well, you'd think by that point they kind of realized things were not fine. But anyway, we'll get into that. That's kind of the sections we'll be looking at. 21 also, the first 7 verses, well, you get the first couple verses, it tells that they came to Jeremiah asking him to inquire of the Lord. He gives 2 answers. He gives an answer to the king, and then he gives an answer that's for the people. And we'll get into that as well. But that's kind of the sections. So I'm going to start right in on Jeremiah 20. Now Pashur, the son of Immer, the priest, who was also chief governor in the house of the Lord, heard that Jeremiah prophesied these things. Then Pashur smote Jeremiah the prophet and put him in stocks that were in the high gate of Benjamin, which was by the house of the Lord. And it came to pass in the morrow that Pashur brought forth Jeremiah out of the stocks. Then said Jeremiah unto him, the Lord hath not called thy name Pashur, but Maggor-Missabib. For thus saith the Lord, behold, I will make thee a terror to thyself and to all thy friends, and they shall fall by the sword of their enemies, and thine eyes shall behold it, and I will give all Judah into the hands of the king of Babylon, and he shall carry them captive unto Babylon, and shall slay them with the sword. Moreover, I will deliver all the strength of this city, and all the labors thereof, and all the precious things thereof, and all the treasures of the kings of Judah will I give unto the hands of their enemies, which shall spoil them, and take them, and carry them to Babylon. And thou, Pashur, and all that dwell in thy house shall go into captivity, and thou shalt come to Babylon, and there thou shalt die, and shalt be buried there, thou and all thy friends, to whom thou hast prophesied lies. So, we have this Pashur. Now what's interesting is in the next chapter, which we'll be getting to in a few minutes, we have another Pashur, but it was a very common name. There are also a couple of variations in the spelling, so I tend to think of it as like Steve in our society. It's one of the most common names, and you got a couple different ways to spell it. But these are not the same person. This Pashur is the son of Immer, whereas in 21, we see Pashur that's the son of Melchiah. And in this case, I don't believe the son of indicates that they're that was their father, but it was their ancestor. And how that's relevant is Immer was one of 24 priests that was given a course, as they call it in the Bible. Basically, they had the high priest, but then other priests, they set up courses. So there were 24 courses in the year. So basically, you had to come serve your duty as your priestly duty for half a month out of the year. And then you go back to your business and whatever it was you did for a living and so forth, but you served, and that makes sense because that's why he was called the chief governor. These were the priests that were in the position that carried on the lineage that served these courses as the governor of the temple. There was the high priest that took care of high priestly things, and these guys would come in on rotation, and some translations will say governor, some will say officer. So Immer, this guy's ancestor, was the 16th of the 24 courses And we find that in 1 Chronicles 24:14. And I'll back up, let's see. I'll just start at the beginning of 24. Now these are the divisions of the sons of Aaron. The sons of Aaron, Nadab and Abihu, Eleazar and Ithamar. But Nadab and Abihu died before their father and had no children. Therefore Eleazar and Ithamar executed the priest office. And David distributed them, both Zadok of the sons of Eleazar and Ahimelech of the sons of Ithamar, according to their offices in their service. And there were more chief men found of the sons of Eleazar than of the sons of Ithamar. And thus were they divided. Among the sons of Eleazar there were 16 chief men of the house of their fathers, and 8 among the sons of Ithamar, according to the house of their fathers. Thus they were divided by lot, one sort with another, for the governors of the sanctuary and governors of the house of God, and were of the sons of Eleazar and the sons of Ithamar. So that's their role. Once David made the temple, they figured out these priests, which were the descendants of Aaron. They came up with 24 guys, so they just split it up to be the governor, to be in charge of the sanctuary and the Lord's house. By the Lord's house, they mean the temple. And I won't read all that, but we do see in 14, it says, in 5th to Bilgah, and the 16th to Immer. And so when it says Pashur is the son of Immer, that's the significance. So I don't know how to figure out when the 16th course was, but a more in-depth Jewish scholar could probably even tell you what time of the year this was, because it's during the course of Immer. But Pashur, who was executing that role of governor of the house of the Lord, heard Jeremiah prophesy these things. And I'm going to back up just the last couple of verses. Last chapter, he'd gone out to the Valley of Hinnom and broke that bottle. And I don't know if that's the words that Pashur's talking about, but also in the last 2 verses of the last chapter, Jeremiah had just came back from the valley and said some things. And some scholars think, and I think this is pretty likely, that he said these things, and Pashur, immediately reacted to them. And the last 2 verses of chapter 19 say, Then came Jeremiah from Tophet, whither the Lord sent him to prophesy, and he stood in the court of the Lord's house, and said to all the people, Thus saith the Lord of hosts, the God of Israel, Behold, I will bring upon this city and upon all her towns all the evil that I have pronounced against it, because they have hardened their necks, that they might not hear my words. So I think that's the words that he had just spoken. And of course, it says he's standing in the court of the temple, and he speaks this. And that's when Pashur, who was in charge of the temple, smote him. It's not clear whether he just, whacked him across the face for that. That's kind of how I envisioned it, but some other people think that he may have been, beaten. And then they put him in stocks. I ran across one translation that said in hold, like it was just a prison cell. There's some debate. Are stocks like we picture stocks? Like I always picture stocks as things, they put your neck and your hands through. And many scholars believe it is something similar to that. But whatever the device was, Jeremiah's put in hold. And, they released him the next day. So overnight, he's thrown in the stocks. And some scholars say the stocks they had back then bound your feet and your hands and kind of twisted you up and were intended to be a device of torture. Others were like, well, it's just a device of restrainment. Exactly what their stocks look like doesn't really matter. You get kind of the idea. He's thrown in the stocks. It says where it is, by the gate of Benjamin. And scholars, can point out right where that is. It's on the north side, top of the hill. And that's where the stocks were. Then we get into verse 3. It says, And it came to pass in the morning, that Pashur brought forth Jeremiah out of the stocks. Then said Jeremiah unto him, The Lord hath not called thy name Pashur, but Maggor-Missabib. And Maggor-Missabib means terror on every side. And he makes this prediction, this prophecy, For thus saith the Lord, Behold, I will make thee a terror to thyself and to all thy friends, and they shall fall by the sword of their enemies, and their eyes shall behold it. And I will give all Judah into the hand of the king of Babylon. He shall carry them captive, and shall slay them with the sword. And then he That's what's gonna happen to his friends. In verse 6, well, in verse 5, he says what's gonna happen to the city, that the strength of the city and the labors thereof and all the precious things are gonna be carried away. And in verse 6, he says what's gonna happen to Pashur. He says, thou, Pashur, and all that dwell in thy house shall go into captivity, and thou shalt come to Babylon, where thou shalt die, and shalt be buried there, and all thy friends, to whom thou hast prophesied lies. And did I end up writing that down? In Nehemiah, the sons of Immer are mentioned in Nehemiah 7:40. So I don't know that these would all be his descendants, but at least his relatives. And there's also a Pashur mentioned. Like I said, there's a lot of Pashurs. It was apparently a very common name. So in Nehemiah 7:41, it mentions a Pashur, and I'm not sure it's the same guy. But the children of Immer, which we know this Pashur was a descendant of Immer, of his children, when they returned from the Babylonian captivity, 1,052 returned. So there's been a lot to point out, and there's been people that just don't read things well and then write commentaries and have pointed out, well, in verse 4 he says they're all going to die, and in verse 6 then he says they'll be carried off to captivity, but we see how many came back. And it's like, well, yes, read this carefully. In verse 4 he says his friends will die, and he will watch them perish on the sword. And in verse 6 he says, and thou, Pashur, and all that dwell in the house will go into captivity. And we kind of see that, and we get to see a very similar thing that happens to his household is what happens to all of Israel. They go into captivity. They're there 70 years, so the current generation would have passed away. But eventually, God restores Israel. There's a remnant that comes back, and of this person's relatives, there were definitely people that came back. And I ran across a commentator that was like, see, this is a contradiction here. And I'm like, no, I can read this pretty carefully, and you don't have to be very smart to see there's no conflict here. He doesn't say Pashur's going to, be killed, and he says his friends are going to be killed, and Pashur's going to be hauled into captivity. So that's basically what I have there on that first section. And then we have Jeremiah's lament, if you will. And it's basically in two paragraphs. It's 7 to 13 and 14 through 18. And a lot of scholars, like I mentioned, think this was what he had to say while he was in the stocks, like he's saying this in the stocks. We don't really know that, but it does seem to be connected to, the shame, discomfort, and so forth that goes with this. And, Jeremiah's lamenting the fact that he has to be a prophet. It's like,
It's kind of interesting that they would say this is gonna be your punishment, you're gonna be in stocks. And then add a little thing there that appears that you can go mistreat this person that's in the stocks. That's okay, but look at our country when they have rules and regulations about people are being punished. That's one of the things you can't have, was
cruel and unusual punishment.
Kind of interesting in relationship to this.
Right. Well, and there were rules in the Mosaic Law about how to punish people. Like when they beat them, they could only beat them with so many stripes and so forth. And so they had. Their standards weren't the same as what our standards would be, but they had rules for how they could punish them as well. So yeah. But a lot of this, yes, it probably was not done gently to Jeremiah, but a lot of it, also would be the shame. You're locked up in public stocks right there. That was kind of the idea of stocks. It was so you could be ridiculed in society. So in verse 7, Jeremiah kind of starts his lament. He says, O Lord, thou hast deceived me, and I was deceived. Thou art stronger than I, and hast prevailed. I am in derision daily. Everyone mocketh me. For since I spake, I cried out. I cried violence and spoil, because the word of the Lord was made a reproach unto me and a derision daily. Then I said, I will not make mention of him, nor speak any more in his name. But his word was in my heart as a burning fire shut up in my bones. And I was weary with forbearing, and I could not stay. For I heard the defaming of many, fear on every side. Report, say they, and we will report it. All my familiars watched for my halting, saying, peradventure he will be enticed, and we shall prevail against him, and we shall take our revenge on him. But the Lord is with me as a mighty terrible one. Therefore my persecutors shall stumble, and they shall not prevail. They shall be greatly ashamed, and they shall not prosper. Their everlasting confusion shall never be forgotten. But, O Lord of hosts, that triest the righteous, and seest the reins and hearts, let me see thy vengeance on them. For unto thee have I opened my cause. Sing unto the Lord, praise ye the Lord, for he hath delivered the soul of the poor from the hands of the evildoer. So, in this part of his lament, he starts out with, O Lord, thou hast deceived me. At least that's what the King James says. And there's two different words here. It says, thou hast deceived me and I was deceived. And they're of the same root word. So if you look at like Strong's, they're both 6601, but they're actually, they're pronounced quite a bit differently, and they're different forms of that word. One is Patani and one is Wapateti. And almost every older scholar, like scholars back in the 1800s, early 1900s, point out that deceived is really not a good translation of this, that persuaded would be closer. So I wanted to look at it, and I looked, and the ASV does use persuaded for both of those words. You persuaded me, and I was persuaded. And King James uses deceived. Of course, that's scholar's point is God doesn't deceive. But that word, when it's used in the King James most of the time, and that first word, patani, or however it's pronounced, is used several times, I think 20-some times in the King James, and is oftentimes translated enticed. In fact, the first usage of it, going back and looking at the first time it's used, is in the giving of the Mosaic Law, and it's if a man entices a maid, is the first use of it, and that's that's usually how it's translated, is enticed. The New King James says induced, but it has a footnote that says induced or enticed. And it reads as, thou hast induced me, and I was persuaded. Which seems closer because they are two different variations of a similar word. But that's the idea. He's not necessarily saying that God lied to him, but that God enticed him to be a prophet, and he was enticed. And that kind of goes with what he said on down in 9, which is very fascinating. He said, I will not make mention of him anymore. But his words was in my heart as a burning fire shut up in my bones, and I was weary with forbearing, and I could not stay. So Jeremiah is kind of like, I didn't really have a choice. I decided to become a prophet. It's miserable. Woe is me. I'm beaten and locked up for this. But God's words are in my bones, burning like a flame. I can't not speak these words. And I read from 7 to 13 because that's kind of one paragraph. He continues his lament in the rest of the chapter. But it kind of changes tone to more of the woe is me. I don't have a lot of commentary on it. There is one thing I found very interesting. I'll read it and then I'll tell you. Cursed be the day wherein I was born. Let not the day wherein my mother bare me be blessed. Cursed be the man who brought tidings to my father, saying, a man-child is born unto thee, making him very glad. And let that man be as the cities which the Lord overthrew, and repented not. And let him hear the cry in the morning, and shouting at the noontide, because he slew me not from the womb, or that my mother might have been my grave, and her womb to always be great with me. Wherefore I came forth out of the womb to see labor and sorrow, that my days should be consumed with shame. what I find interesting is, he's kind of bemoaning the very fact that he was born and he'd rather not have even been born. What's interesting is the Mosaic Law in Deuteronomy 20, verse 9, did not allow you to curse your parents. So Jeremiah does not curse his parents in here. Instead, in verse 15, cursed be the man who brought the tidings to my father. It's like he's getting as close as he can without breaking the Mosaic Law. It's like, I'm not going to curse my parents, but I'm going to curse the man that brought the tidings to my father, saying, a man-child is born unto thee, making him very glad. I found that interesting. As I read that, I'm like, wait a minute. Not cursing his parents, but it's cursing the man that brought the news. And then, of course, he continues in that paragraph, in those few verses, of bemoaning the fact that he was ever born and all that. But as far as cursing, he cursed the day when I was born, and cursed be the man who brought the tidings unto my father. But he wouldn't violate Deuteronomy 29 and curse his parents. So that I found interesting. Any thoughts or comments on 20 before we get into 21? That clock is moving right along. All right. 21. The word which came unto Jeremiah from the Lord when King Zedekiah sent unto him Pashur, the son of Melchiah, and Zephaniah, the son of Messiah, the priest, saying, Inquire, I pray thee, of the Lord for us, for Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, maketh war against us. If so be that the Lord will deal with us according to his wondrous works, that he may go up from us. Like I said, I don't think this was immediately following, the chapter 21 was not immediately following 20. And there are verses, particularly I know that like chapter 24 would have occurred before chapter 21. So like we said, this is not necessarily in chronological order. Some scholars have indicated that Jeremiah put this here because they came to him. And so this is showing that he did receive honor. And he put it here right after, telling about his dishonor. I don't really know if that's the reason. I do know we are getting into a section where he's going to have a lot of things that occurred while they're actually in conflict with Babylon. Not necessarily carried away, but either they're in siege or they're having to pay tribute. And I know we're running low on time, but I'm going to try and read a little bit of the last bit of Chronicles so that we remember the order of all this. King Josiah was kind of the last good king of Israel. And in 2 Chronicles chapter 36, it starts with, the people of the land took Jehoaz, the son of Josiah, and made him king in his father's stead in Jerusalem. And Jehoaz was 23 years old when he began to reign. He reigned 3 months in Jerusalem. And the king of Egypt put him down at Jerusalem and condemned the land to 100 talents of silver and a talent of gold. And the king of Egypt made Eliakim, his brother, king over Judah and Jerusalem, and turned his name to Jehoiakim. And Necho took Jehoaz, his brother, and carried him to Egypt. So the king after Josiah lasted 3 months. A foreign power comes in, puts the land to tribute. They've got to pay taxes, and hauls him away and puts his brother on the throne. Jehoiakim was 25 years old when he began to reign, and he reigned 11 years in Jerusalem and did what was evil in the sight of the Lord his God. And against him came up Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, and bound him in fetters and carried him to Babylon. So we've got this first king after Josiah. He gets carried away to Egypt. The next king gets carried away to Babylon. And it says, and Nebuchadnezzar also carried off the vessels of the house of the Lord to Babylon and put them in the temple of Babylon. Now the rest of the acts of Jehoiakim and his abominations which he did that were found in him, behold, they are written in the book of the kings of Israel and Judah. And Jehoiakim his son reigned in his stead. And Jehoiakim was 8 years old when he began to reign. He reigned 3 months and 10 days in Jerusalem and did what was evil in the sight of the Lord. So now we have another king that lasted 3 months. So you can see there's not what we call political stability at all. And when the year was expired, the king Nebuchadnezzar sent and brought him to Babylon with the goodly vessels of the house of the Lord, and made Zedekiah his brother king over Judah and Jerusalem. And Zedekiah was 21 years old when he began to reign. He reigned 11 years in Jerusalem, and did that which was evil in the sight of the Lord his God, and humbled himself not before Jeremiah the prophet, speaking from the mouth of the Lord. And he also rebelled against King Nebuchadnezzar, who had made him swear by God, and he stiffened his neck and hardened his heart from turning unto the Lord God of Israel. I'm trying to skip ahead, but it just goes on and tells everything bad that happened to him. But we can kind of see, at this point, we've got King Zedekiah, the last king of Israel, sending to Jeremiah to inquire of the Lord what's going to happen. And he sends Pashur, the son of Melchiah, and Zephaniah, the son of Messiah, the priest. Now, much like the last Pashur, there's a little bit of debate among scholars, because it says Pashur, the son of Melchiah, and some people are like, this was not a priest at all. And then it says, and Zephaniah, the son of Messiah, the priest, say. But some of the translations into foreign language has priest as plural, and a lot of scholars believe this Pashur, the son of Melchiah, was also one of those descendants of the priest of the 24 courses. And Melchiah was one of those. He was the 9th course. And Zephaniah, the son of Messiah, was of the 24th course. So most scholars believe this is yet another Pashur who was of the descendants of those 24 priests when David established the temple. And of course, if you remember, Jeremiah was of the priestly line and was the descendant of the priest. I couldn't find anywhere that actually recorded him ever doing the duties of the priest, but he was like the son of a priest. So, but it seems like that both Pashur mentioned here, which was not the same Pashur, and Zephaniah were priests. And the king sent them. And we'll find this Pashur again. He's one of the people that throws Jeremiah into a pit, into the dry cistern with the mud in the bottom. And he's mentioned another time. It's not 100% certain that it's him, but most scholars believe it was him. The other times he's mentioned as the father of, I can't remember the character's name, but most people believe that's the same person. So this guy was no friend or fan of Jeremiah. He definitely, as we'll see later in our studies, he was not in the pro-Jeremiah camp by any means. But the king had sent him, and the king says, so you'll go do. And continuing in verse 3, we get Jeremiah's answer. Then said Jeremiah unto them, thus shall ye say to Zedekiah, thus saith the Lord God of Israel, behold, I will turn back the weapons of war that are in your hands, wherewith ye fight against the king of Babylon and against the Chaldeans, which besiege you without the walls, and I will assemble them into the midst of this city. This is kind of where we know that this is near the end, because he's talking about how they have besieged the city. We didn't really get that from the earlier verses. It just said they were making war against them. But here we kind of indicate that this is towards the very end. We're on the last king, and they have besieged the city. So that helps us to date this passage. Which besiege you without the walls, and I will assemble them into the midst of this city. And I myself will fight against you with an outstretched hand and with a strong arm, even in anger, in fury, and in great wrath. And I will smite the inhabitants of this city, both man and beast, and they shall die of a great pestilence. So this is Jeremiah's answer to the king, because he was, they sent these two priests to go inquire of Jeremiah. And Jeremiah says to the king, I will turn back your weapons in your hands if you fight against the king of Babylon. And I myself will fight against you with an outstretched hand. So it seems as though, even though ever since Josiah, they've gone through all these kings, they've had to pay tribute to Egypt, they've had to pay tribute to Babylon. Babylon's carried away a lot of their stuff, including kings and treasure. It seems as though there's still these people that have this idea that God's going to save them from Babylon. And that's why they're inquiring of the Lord. I guess, as Jeff likes to say, it's hard to find an atheist in a foxhole. I guess once the city's sieged, then they're like, well, let's go inquire of the Lord. Maybe he'll save us. He's done miraculous things in the past, and this is the answer. It's like, no, I will turn your weapons against you, and I will fight against you with an outstretched hand. This is your punishment, which up to this point that's what the whole book of Jeremiah has been about. And Jeremiah started clear back under Josiah, so he's been prophesying for 20 or 30, 20 some, maybe 30 years at this point, something like that, roughly. He's been saying, this is coming, this is going to happen. And, we've spent the last several weeks studying that and seeing how, we started out with the tone of, unless you repent, and then it kind of changed to like, it's coming. And now at the end, they're inquiring of the Lord. And so that was the answer to the king. Now in, did I read verse 7? I'll start back up at 7. But we're going to get into also, like Jeremiah answered the king, and then he's going to have an answer also for the people. And that's what takes up the rest of this chapter. In verse 7 it says, and afterwards, saith the Lord, I will deliver Zedekiah, the king of Judah, and his servants, and the people, and such as are left in this city, from the pestilence, and from the sword, and from the famine, into the hand of Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Babylon, and into the hands of their enemies, and into the hands of those that seek their life. And he shall smite them with the edge of the sword, and he shall not spare them, neither have pity, nor mercy. So that's, I guess, I think I missed reading that, but that's also part of the answer to Zedekiah. It's like, after this siege is over, whoever has, survived the pestilence and the famine that comes with the siege and the sword, they're still going to be delivered into the hand of Nebuchadnezzar and their enemies. In verse 8, Jeremiah delivers a message to the people. He's been speaking to the king. Now it goes to the people. Verse 8 starts out, and unto this people thou shalt say, thus saith the Lord, behold, I set before you the way of life and the way of death. He that abideth in this city shall die by the sword, and by the famine, and by the pestilence. But he that goeth out and falleth to the Chaldeans that besiege you, he shall live, and his life shall be unto him for a prey. For I have set my face against this city for evil, and not for good, saith the Lord. It shall be given into the hand of the king of Babylon, and he shall burn it with fire. And touching the house of the king of Judah, say, hear ye the word of the Lord. O house of David, thus saith the Lord, execute judgment in the morning, and deliver him that is spoiled out of the hand of the oppressor. Lest my fury go out like fire, and burn that none can quench it, because of the evil of your doings. Behold, I am against thee, O inhabitant of the valley and rock of the plain, saith the Lord, which says, who shall come down against us, or who shall enter into our habitations? But I will punish you according to the fruit of your doings, saith the Lord. And I will kindle a fire in the forest thereof, and it shall devour all things round about it. So you can kind of see why the kings were not fans of Jeremiah as a general rule. That changed several times because Jeremiah was a prophet for a long time. But in this case, he's delivered this bad news to the king, and then he has this message for the people that says, you need to surrender. He says, I lay before you the way of life and the way of death. If you stay in the city, you're going to die. If you go out and surrender, you will be captive, but you will live. That's not what the king who's doing a siege wants his people to hear. Go out and surrender. And then he even goes farther than that in these later verses. And again, he's still speaking to the people, but he says, he's got this message in verse 12, O house of David, thus saith the Lord. So he's telling the people, the common citizens, that God has a message for the house of David, who represent the king, for the king, execute judgment and deliver him that is spoiled out of the hand of the oppressor. You've not done justice, and behold, I am against thee, in verse 13. And in verse 14, I will punish you according to the fruit of your doings. So Jeremiah is delivering a message to the general population that God is punishing the rulers. And he's first delivering a message of, I give you a way of life and a way of death. If you want to live, flee and surrender. But also know that I am punishing the house of David. I'm punishing your rulers for what they've done. So, any thoughts? Any questions regarding chapter 21?
Interesting, he uses fire
Mm-hmm.
and nature things, punish people that are out of line.
Right. He mentions kindle a fire against you, and I think that's kind of poetic language about what's coming because he's using the Babylonians to bring it. But he does say in his message that like your weapons will be turned against you, and we saw that much earlier in the Old Testament many times where the enemies of Israel did that, like in I think it was in Judges, the Midianites, like they just destroyed themselves by when Gideon attacked them. And here you see God using that same language that he has previously used with the enemies of Israel, where their enemies had their weapons turned on them. He's telling Israel here, it's like your weapons will be turned on you, and if that doesn't work, I myself will outstretch my hands. In verse 5, 21:5, I myself will fight against you with an outstretched hand and a strong arm, even in anger and in fury and in great wrath. Well, that's exactly what God had said against their enemies also. We've seen him do both of these things where he's turned their enemies' weapons on themselves, and we've seen him fight with an outstretched hand and a strong arm. We've seen that exact language used to defend Israel, and now he's using that same language to condemn Israel and say, if they don't smite you well, I myself will fight you. But he also mentions the things they're going to fall to. They're going to fall to the sword. There's a military campaign. They're going to fall to pestilence, to the famine. Basically God's going to use whatever means he needs to, and he has all those means of getting people to do his bidding and supernatural things. And they're all powers that God has. And I don't know if that's why the king was still inquiring of the Lord, thinking that they had access to that kind of power and that God would still save them. There were a lot of scholars that I read that felt like that's where Zedekiah was, like Jerusalem can't fall, God will always defend it, and that's why they were inquiring of the Lord. To me, it's like after you hear Jeremiah say it's going to fall for 20-some years, and you've already seen numerous kings drug away to Egypt and then to Babylon, and your treasure's already been taken out of the temple, and you're having to pay taxes to these two other foreign countries. It's like, I think you would kind of have the idea that it's that you're kind of in trouble at that point, but that doesn't seem to be the case with these people. So, yeah. All right, well, that's all I have. I think Silas has next week in chapter 22. We'll take just a few minutes and then we'll get started with worship.
How did you get it? It was very short, but so I think you guys must have prayed me. Just one went down the last 93 years.